Hello everyone. In this video series, we're going to be covering how to build a login and registration features for Android applications. This is part two of that video series. And in part one of this series, I built uh, the room entity class, the database connection, and some migrations over here. In this part, we're going to be concerned with building out some helper classes and assisting with which will assist in helping the login and registration functionalities, along with fetching records to and from the database. So before we get started with part two, I'd like to make some clarifications on part one, something I missed in user class. So we're going to need these two fields, password and password salt fields added to user class. So if you haven't done so, please go ahead and add them along with their corresponding getters and setters. Give them a not null column annotation. And once that's done, you'll have to change up your migration as well. So in addition to what we saw last time, we're adding password and password salt fields and then running that migration. So make sure you do that because we'll need the password field and password salt to validate the login process. Okay, so once that's out of the way, we can get started with the database helper class. So the database helper class primarily assists in establishing the connection to the database and also getting some SQL records from the database by querying it with Android Room. So these two functions, those two methods were created as an override, like mandatory override. This is the constructor. So we have a super call, database name, and then parse in, database version. Database name and version are defined up top. Then secondly, we have get database. So for here, we have an instance, and that is an instance of app database, which is our database file. And we're just going to say create database and pass in this context. And then we'll return instance. Okay. So what this is doing is just a simple getter function for getting the database instance so that we can access any records in the user table. Next, we have the create database table. So over here, we have to use the async task execute, and I'm aware this is depreciated, but as this is a very basic tutorial, I find it okay to use this depreciated method. So the reason for using async execute is because we can't make database calls in the main thread as it is UI blocking. So what we have to do is we have to create a separate thread and then run our database queries on that thread. And the way we do that is by using async.execute. So we're instantiating app database class with a room database builder context app database class, and then we pass in the name of the database. And then we say add migrations, migration 1 to build. And then over here, okay, so out of here, room database builder, app database builder, room database builder, context get application context, get application context, app database class context get string database name. So we're building out the database builder class. I'm pretty sure we don't need this async. Sorry about that. We can do it on the main thread. Just what we have to do is use builder, open factory, open helper factory, new asset SQLite open helper factory, and say allow main thread queries. So this will allow us to run queries on the main thread, which is why we didn't need async execute as you saw earlier. So this will allow us to run main thread queries instead of having to create a separate worker thread. And we say build. Okay. And that. So this is our create database method. It basically instantiates the database with the database name, application context, and the app database class, and then returns that while enabling it to run on the main thread and applying this 1-to migration. So this 1-to migration was seen right here. Create that table and then create the database instance. Okay. So, and now we'll move on to get users field SQL query. So this method is primarily used to get the password and password salt of a given username. So you'll notice on the third parameter we have input username field. So basically we're going to query the database for this username using app database get user DAO find by username input username. So find a user by the inputted username and save it to found user instance. If found user is not null, meaning a user was found, then we move on ahead by using a switch statement in which we use password and we use a toast. And a toast message is basically a small dialog box containing text that can be used to notify the user of the application state or anything that the developer deems useful. So we have this found user, and then we say get password. Basically, what we're doing here is returning the password. So if the field type is specified as password, meaning they want the password of that specified user using having that specific username, then we return the password while saying while giving a toast message for the user. And then password salt, same thing. Oh, actually, we don't even need this. Sorry about that. We won't need a toast message because it's not important to tell the end user that a user was found. So basically what we're doing is we have the user field type. If they specify user password salt, then we return password salt. If not, we return password. And we finish off with make text context and user was not found in the database. And then we say show. We're missing something here. Length long. So if the application gets to this point, obviously it didn't go through if found user not null, meaning a user is not found, to which a toast message is shown to the end user, and we return null. So pretty simple stuff, and this method is going to be useful in helping out with the login. Basically, we're getting the application, the database password, and comparing with the input password. Next, we can move on to functions. So if you haven't already, create a class, Java class called functions, database helper session manager, and we'll add two functions. So in functions, we're going to use a fragment manager, fm, app compat activity, context, get support fragment manager, dialog frag, new fragment. And then we say new fragment show dialog. And if you're wondering what this is doing, it's basically displaying a fragment in an activity. So basically a fragment is not an activity. An activity is an application component that gives a user interface where the user can interact with, whereas a fragment is only part of an activity. So a fragment is dependent on an activity, but an activity is not dependent on a fragment. It basically contributes its UI to that specified dependent on activity. And what we have here is a show progress dialog. Basically, when the user clicks the login button or the login button, we want a slight half-second delay where it shows a loading screen, and this fragment is representing that loading screen. So we're creating a new fragment using dialog fragment class, and we're showing it using the show method, and then we return it. Okay. So next we move on to session manager. So session manager is primarily used to manage the session. Basically, has the user logged on or are they in logged out state? Those questions can only be answered if we preserve the user's authentication status. To preserve that status, we need the session manager class. And what we're doing here is we're instantiating pref and editor with shared preferences is logged in, and over in set login, we're using editor and we're put boolean key is logged in. So basically we're toggling the boolean key is logged in to true or false, depending on whether or not the user is logged in. And then we call editor.commit and then logd tag user login session. Yeah. So once a toggle has been made or a change, then we just log user session has been modified. Anyway, that's all for session manager. It's pretty simple. It's like an on-off switch. Is the user logged on? Has the user just logged in? If so, we want is he logged in to be true. We set that to true so that the rest of the application can know whether or not the user has logged in or not. So once we have that done, we can move on to the widget package and building out progress bar dialog. So if you haven't already, create a new package called widget, and inside it create a new Java class called progress bar dialog. And this progress bar dialog is going to extend a dialog fragment, and it's basically going to represent our loading screen. Our loading screen will briefly appear for about half a second in order to give the user a bit of pause and for the application to process some data um, in the context of validating the user data or the user login details. Um, but yeah, so that's what it does. Uh, so let's start out with the Oncreate method. First, we need a super call, saved instance state, and then we say bundle, get arguments. Then we move on to the new instance method, and we use my fragment new progress dialog. What we're doing here is we're instantiating this fragment. And we're setting the title to title, which is a passed in argument. And we're setting the arguments to args. And then we'll say return my fragment. So basically, we're creating a progress bar dialog instance. Then we're setting the title, giving it some arguments, and then we're returning it. Obviously, the arguments are going to be empty because we're not tampering with the args instance, and then we're returning it. Next, we're going to be using onCreateView. So this method is going to be called when the fragment is initially created, and it always needs a super call. Next, we say return inflator, inflate. So basically, inflate means to show this layout that we're going to specify right here. And this layout will represent this fragment. So without this line, this class, this fragment wouldn't know which layout to instantiate or represent as its fragment. So we're saying inflate this layout for this container and don't attach it to root. So keep this false. And this is the layout we have. So layout dialog progress. Just a simple constraint layout with nothing in it because we don't need that much to show a loading screen. So now, once we have that done, we've done a majority of what we have to do except for this part. So regarding the user, we're going to need a user field type consisting of username, email, first name, last name, password, salt, and password. And the reason for doing this is because in one of our, let's see. Okay, so this is a bit skipping ahead, but what we're doing here is we're using this enum to constrain the number of options that we can pass into the get user fields SQL query. You could use a string, you could use just password, but it's a best practice to use enums instead of strings because it limits the amount of variables that the function will accept. For example, you have this get user field SQL query. It takes in this type of enum. So only these options would be valid. Whereas if you left it as a string, you could do just about anything. And that switch statement, you're going to definitely need a default case, or, I mean, there's a lot that could go wrong. So this is a good way of constraining the amount of complexity or simplifying things. Anyway, so we've reached the end of our part two, which is the helpers. Um, Part three is gonna pertain to the activities. So we're gonna build out login and registration activities, and maybe even cover some of the XML files, although this might be quite tedious. So make sure to check out my GitHub source code for this. I'll attach it in the description, so you can easily check out what if you get stuck in anywhere, because this is obviously not gonna, you'll obviously run into errors. So it's very helpful to have a second source that you can verify with. Anyways, I'll also attach my blog post to this video description below, so that you can have more guidance. Thank you for watching my video. If you liked it, please make sure to like and subscribe. And stay tuned for part three, where I'll show you how to implement the activities, and we'll finish off this series. So thanks again for watching, and have a great day.